the love of fate. Whether we like it or not, our lives will leave a mark on the universe. Each person's birth makes ripples that expand in the social environment. Parents, siblings, relatives, and friends are affected by it, and as we grow up, our actions leave a myriad of consequences, some intended, most not. Our consumer decisions make a tiny difference in the economy. Political decisions affect the future of the community, and each kind or mean act modifies slightly the total quality of human well-being. Persons whose lives are autotelic help to reduce entropy in the consciousness of those who come in contact with them. Those who devote all their psychic energy to competing for resources and to aggrandizing their own self add to the sum total of entropy. One cannot lead a life that is truly excellent without feeling that one belongs to something greater and more permanent than oneself. This is one conclusion that is common to all the various religions that have given meaning to people's lives through all the long epochs of human history. Nowadays, still heady from the great advances brought about by science and technology, we are in danger of forgetting this insight. In the United States and the other technologically advanced societies, individualism and materialism have almost completely prevailed over allegiance to the community and to spiritual values. It is significant that Dr. Benjamin Spock, whose advice about child-rearing was so immensely influential among at least 2 generations of parents, in the twilight of his life, doubts that the stress placed earlier on training children to be unfettered individualists was such a good idea. He now feels that it is at least as essential for them to learn to work for a common good and to appreciate religion, art, and the other ineffable aspects of life. In fact, the warning signs that we have become too enamored of ourselves are many. An example is the inability of people to form commitments, which has resulted in half the urban population in developed countries spending their lives alone, and in the dissolution of such a high proportion of marriages. Another is the increasing disillusionment that people report in survey after survey with most of the institutions that we had previously trusted, and with the individuals who lead them. More and more we seem to bury our heads in the sand to avoid hearing bad news, withdrawing into gated communities protected by armed response. But a good personal life is impossible while staying aloof of a corrupt society, as Socrates knew, and those who have lived under recent dictatorships have found out. It would be so much easier if we were responsible only for ourselves. Unfortunately, things don't work that way. An active responsibility for the rest of humankind and for the world of which we are a part is a necessary ingredient of a good life. The real challenge, however, is to reduce entropy in one's surroundings without increasing it in one's consciousness. The Buddhists have a good piece of advice as to how this can be done. Act always as if the future of the universe depended on what you did, while laughing at yourself for thinking that whatever you do makes any difference. It is this serious playfulness, this combination of concern and humility, that makes it possible to be both engaged and carefree at the same time. With this attitude, one does not need to win to feel content. Helping to maintain order in the universe becomes its own reward, regardless of consequences. Then it is possible to find joy, even when fighting a losing battle in a good cause. The first step out of this impasse is to gain a clearer understanding of one's self, the image each person develops about who he or she is. We couldn't get very far without a self, but the downside of the self-image is that as soon as it emerges in early childhood, it begins to control the rest of consciousness. Because we identify ourselves with it, believing it to be the central essence of our being, the self increasingly appears to be not only the most important among the contents of consciousness, but, at least for some people, the only one worth paying attention to. The danger is that one's entire psychic energy will go towards satisfying the needs of the imaginary entity we have ourselves created. This might not be too bad if the self we bring into being is a reasonable entity, but children who are abused may grow up constructing a hopeless or vindictive image of self. Children who are indulged without being loved may create narcissistic selves. A self may grow to be insatiable or have a completely exaggerated idea of its importance. Persons who own such a distorted self nevertheless feel compelled to satisfy its needs. If they think they need more power, or money, or love, or adventure, they will do everything to satisfy that need, even beyond what is good for them in the long run. In such cases, a person's psychic energy, directed by an ill-conceived ego, is likely to cause entropy in the environment, as well as within consciousness. Being without a sense of self An animal will exert itself until its biological needs are satisfied, but not much further. It will attack a prey, defend its territory, fight for a mate, but when these imperatives are taken care of, it will rest. If, however, a man develops a self-image based on power or wealth, there are no limits to his exertions. He will pursue the goal set by the self relentlessly, even if he has to ruin his health in the process, even if he has to destroy other people along the way. It is not so surprising, then, that so many religions have blamed the ego for being the cause of human unhappiness. The radical advice is to neuter the ego by not allowing it to dictate desires. If we refuse to heed our needs by giving up food, sex, and all the vanities that men strive for, the ego will eventually have no say in what to do, and will shrivel and die. But there is no way to completely do away with the ego and still survive. The only viable alternative is to follow a less radical course and make sure that one gets to know oneself and understands its peculiarities. It is then possible to separate those needs that really help us to navigate through life from those malignant growths that sprout from them and make our lives miserable. When asked what has been the most difficult obstacle to overcome in his career, the novelist Richard Stern answered, "I think it's that rubbishy part of myself, the part which is described by such words as vanity, pride, the sense of not being treated as I should be, comparison with others, and so on. I've tried rather hard to discipline that, and I've been lucky that there has been enough that's positive to enable me to counter a kind of biliousness and resentment, which I've seen paralyze colleagues of mine, peers who are more gifted than I. I've felt it in myself, and I've had to learn to counter that. I would say that the chief obstacle is one's self." For each of us, the chief obstacle to a good life is oneself. Yet if we learn to live with it, and like Ulysses, find a way to resist the siren song of its needs, the self can become a friend, a helper, a rock upon which to build a fulfilling life. Stern goes on to describe how, as a writer, he can tame the unbridled ego and make it do creative work. He said, "Of course there are things in myself which I know are bad, mean, twisted, weak, this, that, or the other thing. I can draw strength from that. I can transform them. They're sources of strength. And as I said earlier, the writer takes those, and they're his material." One need not be an artist to transform the rubbishy parts of the self into a deeper understanding of the human condition. We all have the opportunity to use ambition, the need to be loved, even aggressiveness, in constructive ways, without being carried away by them. Once we realize what our demons are, we need not fear them any longer. Instead of taking them seriously, we can smile with compassion at the arrogance of these fruits of our imagination. We don't have to feed their ravenous hunger except on our own terms, when to do so helps us achieve something worthwhile. Of course, this is easier said than done. Ever since the Delphic oracle started giving the sensible advice, "Know thyself," some 3,000 years ago, people who thought about these things agreed that one must first come to know and then master the ego before embarking on a good life. Yet we have made very little progress in the direction of self-knowledge. All too often those who extol most loudly the virtues of selflessness turn out to be motivated by greed and ambition. In our century, the project of self-knowledge has been most strongly identified with Freudian analysis. Shaped by the radical cynicism of the between-war years, psychoanalysis set its sights modestly. It offered self-knowledge without aspiring to tell what one should do with it, once attained. And the understanding it offered, profound as it was rather limited to revealing only some of the snares that the ego typically falls into, the malignancies that result from trying to cope with the family triangle and the subsequent repression of sexuality. Important as this insight has been, it had the unfortunate result of providing a false sense of security to people who believed that by exercising some childhood trauma, they would live happily ever after. The self, alas, is more cunning and complicated than that. Psychotherapy relies primarily on recalling and then sharing past experiences with a trained analyst. This process of guided reflection can be very useful, and in its form it does not differ that much from the injunction of the Delphic oracle. The difficulty comes when the popularity of this form of therapy leads people to believe that by introspecting and ruminating upon their past, they will solve their problems. This usually does not work, because the lenses through which we look at the past are distorted precisely by the kind of problems we want to solve. It takes an expert therapist, or long practice, to benefit from reflection. Moreover, the habit of rumination that our narcissistic society encourages actually might make things worse. The ESM research shows that when people think about themselves, their moods are usually negative. When a person starts to reflect without being skilled at it, the first thoughts that pop into the mind tend to be depressing. Whereas in flow, we forget ourselves. In apathy, worry, and boredom, the self is usually at center stage. So unless one has mastered the skill of reflection, the practice of thinking about problems usually aggravates whatever is wrong instead of alleviating it. Most people only think about themselves when things are not going well, and thereby they enter a vicious circle in which present anxiety colors the past, and then the painful memories make the present even more bleak. One way to break out of this circle is to develop the habit of reflecting on one's life when there is reason to feel good about it, when one is in an upbeat mood. But it is even better to invest psychic energy in goals and relationships that bring harmony to the self indirectly. After experiencing flow in a complex interaction, the feedback is concrete and objective, and we feel better about ourselves without having had to try. In order to experience flow, it helps to have clear goals. Not because it is achieving the goals that is necessarily important, but because without a goal, it is difficult to concentrate and avoid distractions. Thus, a mountain climber sets as her goal to reach the summit not because she has some deep desire to reach it, but because the goal makes the experience of climbing possible. If it were not for the summit, the climb would become pointless ambling that leaves one restless and apathetic. There is quite extensive evidence showing that even if one does not experience flow, just the fact of doing something in line with one's goals improves the state of mind. For example, being with friends is usually uplifting, especially if we see that interacting with friends is what we want to do at the moment. But if we feel we should be working, then the time spent with the same friends is much less positive. Conversely, even a disliked job makes us feel better if we manage to see it as part of our goals. These findings suggest that a simple way of improving the quality of life is to take ownership of one's actions. A great deal of what we do, over 2/3 on average, are things we feel we have to do, or we do because there isn't anything else we feel like doing. Many people spend their entire lives feeling like puppets who move only because their strings are pulled. Under these conditions, we are likely to feel that our psychic energy is wasted. So the question is, why don't we want to do more things? The sheer act of wanting focuses attention, establishes priority in consciousness, and thus creates a sense of inner harmony. There are many things in life that we must do and don't like doing. It may be sitting in meetings, or taking out the garbage, or keeping track of bills. Some of these are unavoidable. No matter how ingenious we are, we still must do them. So the choice is either to do them against the grain, grumbling about the imposition, or do them willingly. In both cases, we are stuck with having to do the activity, but in the second case, the experience is bound to be more positive. One can set goals for even the most despised task. For instance, to mow the lawn as quickly and efficiently as possible. The very act of setting the goal will take much of the sting out of a chore. This attitude toward one's chores is well expressed in the concept of amor fati, or love of fate, a central concept in Nietzsche's philosophy. For instance, in discussing what it takes to live fully, he writes, "My formula for greatness in a human being is amor fati, that one wants nothing to be different, not forward, not backward, not in all eternity, not merely bear what is necessary, but love it." And he also wrote, "I want to learn more and more to see as beautiful what is necessary in things. Then I shall be one of those who make things beautiful." Abraham Maslow's studies led him to similar conclusions. Based on his clinical observations and interviews with individuals he considered to be self-actualizing, including creative artists and scientists, he concluded that the processes of growth resulted in fulfilling peak experiences. These involved a consistency between self and environment, and he referred to this as harmony between inner requiredness and outer requiredness, or between I want and I must. When this happens, he writes, one freely, happily, and wholeheartedly embraces one's determinants. One chooses and wills one's fate. The psychologist Carl Rogers also endorsed a very similar perspective. He comments about what he calls the fully functioning person. He wills or chooses to follow the course of action, which is the most economical vector in relation to all the internal and external stimuli, because it is that behavior which will be the most deeply satisfying. As a result, he continues, the fully functioning person not only experiences but utilizes the most absolute freedom when he spontaneously, freely, and voluntarily chooses and wills that which is absolutely determined. Thus, as with Nietzsche and Maslow, the love of fate corresponds to a willingness to accept ownership of one's actions, whether these are spontaneous or imposed from the outside. It is this acceptance that leads to personal growth and provides the feeling of serene enjoyment which removes the burden of entropy from everyday life. The quality of life is much improved if we learn to love what we have to do. In this, Nietzsche and company were absolutely right. But in retrospect, one can begin to see the limitations of the humanistic psychology of which Maslow and Rogers were such outstanding leaders. In the glory days of the mid-century, when prosperity reigned and peace beckoned around the corner, it made sense to assume that personal fulfillment could only lead to positive outcomes. There was no need then to make invidious comparisons about ways of fulfilling oneself, to question whether one set of goals was better than another. What mattered was to do one's thing. The optimistic haze blunted all edges, and we permitted ourselves to believe that the only evil came from not fulfilling one's potential. The problem is that people also learn to love things that are destructive to themselves and to others. Teenagers arrested for vandalism or robbery often have no other motivation than the excitement they experience stealing a car or breaking into a house. Veterans say that they never felt such intense flow as when they were behind a machine gun on the front lines. When the physicist Robert J. Oppenheimer was developing the atomic bomb, he wrote with lyrical passion about the sweet problem he was trying to solve. From all accounts, Adolf Eichmann enjoyed working on the logistic problems involved in transporting Jews to extermination camps. The moral implication of these examples is clearly different, but they make the point that enjoying what one does is not sufficient reason for doing it. Flow is a source of psychic energy in that it focuses attention and motivates action. Like other forms of energy, it is neutral. It can be used for constructive or destructive purposes. Fire can be used to warm us up on a cold night, or it can be used to burn down the house. The same is true of electricity or nuclear energy. Making energy available for human use is an important accomplishment, but learning how to use it well is at least as essential. Thus, in creating a good life, it is not enough to strive for enjoyable goals, but also to choose goals that will reduce the sum total of entropy in the world. So, where is one to find such goals? It has been the task of religions to define entropy as it applies to human affairs. It was called sin, and it consisted in behavior that harmed the person, the community, or its values. All societies that have survived have had to define positive goals to direct the energy of their people. To make them effective, they created supernatural beings who communicated the rules of right and wrong behavior through visions, apparitions, and texts dictated to special individuals, like Moses, Muhammad, or Joseph Smith. These goals could not be justified only in terms of our lives here and now, because if the only effects of our actions were the ones we could observe in this life, common sense would dictate that we get as much pleasure and material advantage as we can, even if we must be ruthless in the process. Yet a community would be destroyed if everyone was motivated by sheer selfishness. So all religions had to provide a scenario for what happens to those who act only in terms of self-interest, such as being reincarnated in a lower form of life, or being forgotten, or going to hell. One of the main challenges of our time is to discover new bases for transcendent goals that fit with whatever else we know about the world. A new myth to give meaning to life, if you will, but one that will serve us for the present and the near future, just as earlier myths have helped our ancestors make sense of their existence, relying on the images, metaphors, and facts known to them. But just as the elements of past myths were believed to be true to those who used them, we have also to believe in the truth of this new dispensation. In the past, it was the prophets who voiced the myths that gave power to the beliefs of the community. Drawing on familiar images, they intimated that a supreme being was speaking through them to tell the people how they should behave and what the world beyond our senses was like. There may still be prophets in the future claiming to know such things, but it is less likely that they will be believed. One consequence of depending on science for solving material problems and on democracy for solving political conflicts is that we have learned to distrust the vision of a single individual, no matter how inspired. Of course, the cult of personality is still very much alive, but it is more tempered by healthy skepticism. A credible revelation would have to have that element of consensus we have come to expect from scientific truth and from democratic decision-making. Instead of waiting for prophets, we may discover the foundations on which to build a good life from the knowledge scientists and other thinkers are slowly accumulating. There are enough hints about how the universe functions to know that what kind of actions support the increase of complexity and order, and what kind lead toward destruction. We are rediscovering how all forms of life depend on each other and on the environment, how precisely each action produces an equal reaction, how difficult it is to create order and useful energy, and how easy it is to waste it in disorder. We learn that the consequences of actions may not be immediately visible, but may have effects in distant connections, because everything that exists is part of an interconnected system. Much of this has already been said, in one way or another, in the religions of the Plains Indian tribes, the Buddhists, the Zoroastrians, and innumerable other beliefs based on a careful observation of life. What contemporary science adds is a systematic expression of these facts in a language that has authority in our times. But there are also other, perhaps more exciting insights latent in modern science. For instance, the implications of relativity might suggest a way to reconcile the monotheistic beliefs that have been so successful in the last 2 millennia, and the more fragmented, idiosyncratic polytheistic forms they replaced. The disadvantage of polytheism has been that when people actually believed in the existence of separate spirits, demiurges, demons, and gods, each with its own character and sphere of authority, it caused a great deal of confusion and dissipation of attention among the competing spiritual entities. The postulate of a single God, whether by the Israelites, the Christians, or the Muslims, reordered the believer's consciousness, releasing a tremendous amount of psychic energy, which swept other faiths aside. However, the downside of monotheism was that by specifying a single supreme being, it tended to develop into rigid dogmatism. What relativity and the more recent discoveries about fractal geometrics may suggest is that the same reality may be packaged in different bundles, so to speak, and that depending on the perspective of the viewer, the angle of vision, the time frame, and the scale of observation, one might see very different pictures of the same underlying truth. Thus, there is no need to brand as heresy visions and insights that differ from the beliefs we learned as children. Yet we also know that these are locally valid, temporary manifestations of a single underlying process of enormous complexity. Many of the relevant strands converge around the process of evolution. Ironically, while Darwin's observations were justly seen as a threat to fundamentalist Christian religion, the idea that over very long periods of time, ecological systems and the structure of organisms tend toward increasing complexity has given hope to several scientists that the universe is not ruled by chaos, but conceals a meaningful story. One of the earliest to express this connection was the Jesuit paleontologist Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, whose The Phenomenon of Man gave a lyrical, and perhaps excessively lyrical, description of evolution from atomic dust billions of years ago to the unification of mind and spirit in what he called the Omega Point, his equivalent for the traditional concept of souls joining with the Supreme Being in heaven. Teilhard's vision was derided by most scientists, but some of the more adventurous ones, such as C.H. Waddington, Julian Huxley, and Theodosius Dobzhansky, took it rather seriously. In one form or other, evolving complexity has the making of a myth robust enough to hang a faith on. For instance, Jonas Salk, the inventor of the polio vaccine, who saw himself to be as much an artist and a humanist as a scientist, spent the last years of his life struggling to understand how past life may hold the key to the future. In his words, "I have continued to be interested in some more fundamental questions about creativity itself. I see us as a product of the process of evolution. I would say creative evolution. We have now become the process itself, or part of the process itself, and so from that perspective, I have become interested in universal evolution, the phenomenon of evolution in itself, as manifest in what I call biological evolution, evolution of the physical, chemical world, biological evolution, and metabiological evolution of the brain-mind. And now I'm beginning to write about what I call teleological evolution, which is evolution with a purpose. So my purpose now, you might say, is to try to understand evolution, creativity, in a purposeful way." It is too soon to see clearly what lies beyond these new horizons that are just opening up, but writers and scientists are beginning to piece together the vision that might lead into the future. Some of these efforts still seem so fanciful as to be part of only the realm of imagination. For instance, Madeleine L'Engle has woven into her novels for children plots where events in the cells of the body parallel historical struggles among human characters, which in turn reflect cosmic conflicts between supernatural beings. and she is perfectly aware that the science fiction she writes has ethical consequences. Even when the characters in the book suffer and are about to be engulfed by the forces of evil, she believes that you have to get them out into some kind of hope. I don't like hopeless books. Books that make you think, oh, life's not worth living. I want to leave them thinking, yeah, this endeavor is difficult, but it is worth it. It is ultimately joyful. John Archibald Wheeler, one of the most distinguished physicists of this century, spent his time puzzling about how we play a vital part in bringing about the material world that seems to exist objectively outside and apart from ourselves. Benjamin Spock, the eminent pediatrician, is trying to redefine spirituality in terms that make sense for our times. And then there are those who, like the economist and activist Hazel Henderson, have adopted a joyously free-form personal philosophy in which their identity is seen as a momentary embodiment of the ongoing stream of life. She says, "On one level, I feel like an extraterrestrial. I'm here visiting for a while, and I'm also in human form. I'm very emotionally attached to the species, and so I have incarnated myself at this time. But I also have an infinite aspect to myself. It all kind of hangs together quite easily for me. It sounds flippant, but the thing is that this is a spiritual practice for me." It may seem that such pagan exuberance is nothing more than a return to past superstitions, on a par with belief in reincarnation, alien abductions, or extrasensory perception. The essential difference is that New Age believers take their faith literally, while the people I am quoting know that they are speaking metaphorically, using approximations to an underlying reality they believe in, but cannot express adequately. They would be the last to reify their insights, believing them to be literally true. They know that their knowledge is itself evolving, and in a few years might have to be expressed in entirely different terms. It is one thing for evolution to help us envision the future with reference to the past, and another to give us directions for creating a meaningful, satisfying existence. Surely one of the reasons traditional religions have had such a powerful hold on human consciousness is that they personalized cosmic forces. For instance, by claiming that God created us in His image, thus making it possible for thousands of Christian painters to represent Him as a benign old patriarch. And perhaps more importantly, they lent each individual's life dignity and the promise of eternity. This is indeed a hard act to follow. The process of evolution, as we understand it now, works statistically on large numbers and has nothing to say about individuals. It is run by determinism coupled with chance instead of purpose and free will. Thus it appears to be an arid doctrine with no chance to inspire a person to organize his or her life with reference to it. Yet the findings of science may have hopeful things to say to each of us. In the first place, they make us increasingly aware of how unique each person is, not only in the particular way the ingredients of the genetic code have been combined, yielding instructions for developing unprecedented physical and mental traits, but also unique in the time and the place in which this particular organism has been set to encounter life. Because an individual becomes a person only within a physical, social, and cultural context, when and where we happen to be born defines a single coordinate of existence that no one else shares. Thus, each of us is responsible for one particular point in space and time in which our body and mind forms a link within the total network of existence. For whereas it is true that who we are is determined by genetic instructions and social interactions, it is also true that having invented the concept of freedom, we can make choices that will determine the future shape of the network of which we are a part. What kind of cosmetics we use will help determine whether the air will stay fit to breathe. How much time we spend talking to teachers will affect what our children learn. And the kind of shows we watch will influence the nature of commercial entertainment. Contemporary understanding of matter and energy also suggests a new way of thinking about good and evil. Evil in human affairs is analogous to the process of entropy in the material universe. We call evil that which causes pain, suffering, disorder in the psyche or the community. It usually involves taking the course of least resistance, or operating according to the principles of a lower order of organization. For instance, when a person endowed with consciousness acts in terms of instincts alone, or when a social being acts selfishly even though the situation calls for cooperation. When scientists work on perfecting means of destruction, they are succumbing to entropy even if they use the latest and most sophisticated knowledge. Entropy or evil is the default state, the condition to which systems return unless work is done to prevent it. What prevents it is what we call good, that is, actions that preserve order while preventing rigidity, that are informed by the needs of the most evolved systems. Acts that take into account the future, the common good, the emotional well-being of others. Good is the creative overcoming of inertia, the energy that leads to the evolution of human consciousness. To act in terms of new principles of organization is always more difficult and requires more effort and energy. The ability to do so is what has been known as virtue. But why should one be virtuous when it is so much easier to let entropy prevail? Why should one want to support evolution without the promise of eternal life as a reward? If what we have said so far is true, eternal life is actually part of the package of existence, not in the way cartoons represent afterlife, with haloed characters and nightgowns standing around on clouds, but in the fact that our actions in this life are going to reverberate through time and shape the evolving future. Whether our present consciousness of individuality is preserved in some dimension of existence after death, or disappears completely, the unalterable fact is that our being will forever remain part of the warp and woof of what is. The more psychic energy we invest in the future of life, the more we become a part of it. Those who identify with evolution blend their consciousness with it, like a tiny creek joining an immense river, whose currents become as one. Hell, in this scenario, is simply the separation of the individual from the flow of life. It is clinging to the past, to the self, to the safety of inertia. There is a trace of this sense in the root of the word for devil. It comes from the Greek diabolin, to separate or break asunder. What is diabolical is to weaken the emerging complexity by withdrawing one's psychic energy from it. Of course, this is not the only way to read what science implies about the future. It is also possible to see nothing but meaningless chance at work in the world and be discouraged by it. In fact, it is easier to do so. Entropy holds also for how we interpret the evidence of the senses. But this chapter started with the question, how can we find a goal that will allow us to enjoy life while being responsible to others? Choosing this interpretation for the current knowledge science provides might be one answer to that question. Within an evolutionary framework, we can focus consciousness on the tasks of everyday life in the knowledge that when we act in the fullness of the flow experience, we are also building a bridge to the future of our universe.